Sir holds a PhD in computer science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Sir has co-authored about 75 papers with more than 7,000 citations in Google Scholar and a H index of 46. And Sir has 19 US patents. While at IBM, Sir received 2 Outstanding Technical Achievement Awards, an Outstanding Innovation Award, and the Lou Genster Team Award for Client Excellence. Sir is a Fellow of ASEAN and Indian National Academy of Engineering. Sir is also a recipient of the Distinguished Alumnus Award for IIT Delhi. A brief intro about the lecture. Artificial intelligence, especially the field of machine learning, is transforming virtually all aspects of our life. This talk describes the culinary efforts at Google Research India to tackle problems arising in Indian context and beyond. Basically, a critical need and an opportunity to improve health outcomes globally at lower costs and specific challenges in countries like India, which has an acute shortage of doctors. Sir will be taking several examples and case studies to explain AI in India and beyond. Sir, we are so glad that you accepted our invitation and gave us your precious time. I now request Dr. Manish Gupta, sir, to please begin the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. So I hope you're able to see my screen, my slides.
Yes,
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'll talk about again our work on AI for problems arising in the Indian context, and again we aspire to also take some of these solutions also beyond India. So so AI today is really changing everything around us. I've shown a few pictures here. So you see a photograph of a self-driving car, and you see self-driving cars beginning to appear in some cities in the world. And if you think about what all a self-driving car needs to do, it needs to, with the help of various cameras and so on, it needs to then automatically infer the state of the road, the state of the traffic around the car, and you have to make these decisions in real time. So a lot of that is now is already happening through the use of AI. We have also seen, I mean, things like the middle. There's a photograph of a car factory. So if you today were to visit the floor of a car factory, you'll find very few humans. It's all of this assembly and so on is largely being done by robots. And also, I mean, if you look at the Indian IT services industry, that itself is going through a major transformation, where a lot of the work that has been traditionally done manually in terms of managing the various servers and storage systems, or even taking care of calls from the customer, you are beginning to see a lot of automation in offering these services. And again, it is referred to as robotic process automation. So one natural question which I just wanted to address is there anything special about today's times? I mean, why is all of this happening now? And I'll just use a very simple kind of a story-based explanation for why. I mean, in one sense, you could argue, I mean, we've been making progress in technology. Again, overall in technology since centuries, and then in the information technology over the last, again, several decades. So in a sense, you can think of it as continuation of that progress. But I'll also make the argument that today's times are truly special. And I wanted to illustrate that with the help of this story. So if you look at this picture, many of you may recognize the story that this picture is trying to illustrate. There are various versions. I mean, one that I heard when I was growing up was there was a great chess player who pleased the king, and the king asked him, "Okay, what reward do you want?" And he pointed to the chessboard and he said, "Give me 1 grain of rice for the first square, double the grains of rice for the next square, and keep doubling, and just give me enough to cover to cover the entire chessboard. And the king initially said, "Is that all you want? I mean, ask for something bigger." And he said, "No, that's all I want." And and it was as the king started to kind of say, "Okay, let's give this person what he has asked for." Uh, it was only when you got to the middle of the chessboard that the king realized that he would not be able to honor the promise, that the kingdom would go bankrupt and still he would not be able to honor the promise. He didn't realize it when you were at the first initial few squares. It was when you got to the millions of grains. And so that's the power of exponentiation. And I'm arguing that a similar thing is going on with computing. And the analogous exponentiation that we have been dealing with is something known as Moore's law, which was proposed by Gordon Moore in the year 1965. So Gordon Moore later on became one of the co-founders of Intel Corporation, and when he wrote the paper in 1965, so it's not like a real law of physics like Newton's laws of motion and so on, but it was basically a prediction that Gordon Moore made in a paper that he wrote in 1965 that uh, as you design these integrated circuits, in every new generation of integrated circuit, you should be able to double the number of transistors. And that prediction turned out to be surprisingly accurate, and the industry, in fact, started working really hard to make that prediction come true with every successive generation of integrated circuits that were developed. So now Moore's law is really slowing down. So that's after like more than 60 years. But what we have enjoyed in the last 5 decades are these is this doubling of compute power, which was a direct result of doubling of this number of transistors on a chip with every new generation. So analogous to this whole doubling of grains of rice. And in fact, this analogy with grains of rice is very apt because somebody told me a factoid that in the year 2006, we started producing as humans, we started producing more transistors than grains of rice in the year 2006. And of course, since then, we have come a long ways. And at this point, we are producing many more transistors, right? Over a factor of maybe 10 to 100 higher number of transistors compared to grains of rice. So I'm arguing roughly that maybe around the year 2006, when we started producing more transistors than grains of rice, we also entered this era analogous to this second half of the chessboard, where the king realized he would not be able to honor the promise. The number of grains of rice was just too large, that a lot of like these expensive computations that previously we thought were infeasible, they started to become feasible. So we are now in this era where we have so much of abundant computational power at our disposal that things that let's say when I had just graduated with my PhD and started working, the kind of computation that I would have thought, right? I mean, basically would be the kind of applications that I would have thought as science fiction are now possible today. So for instance, today you can take a photograph of a person with a mobile phone. So a mobile phone today carries more computational power than some of these supercomputers, which were the US government used to restrict the export of these supercomputers, right? So I remember in the 90s, India wasn't allowed to import one of these supercomputers built by Cray because of restrictions by the US government. And today, the mobile phones that we all carry, they have more computational power than that supercomputer that India wasn't allowed to import. So we are in a very different era. And one of the things that this computational power has really made possible is it has really led to this comeback of one of the kind of technologies that was given up in the 80s of artificial neural networks. So those are now known as deep learning systems. So today, I'm sure everybody in the audience would have heard of the term deep learning. And deep learning is essentially just a reincarnation, a modern version of these artificial neural networks, which in the 80s, the research community gave up on them because, again, they weren't able to solve meaningful problems. But now, with the amount of computational power that we have at our disposal, we are able to use these artificial neural networks for some very, very interesting problems. So, one example of a problem is again illustrated on this slide, that you can feed it this data, which is the image of a cat, and the image of a cat ultimately shows up in the form of the data, which is represented in the form of pixels. And when you feed this neural network all of that data corresponding to all those pixel values, there's a very, these neural networks, these are built with very simple uh, uh, units, which might be simply like taking the input, multiplying it by some simple weight, adding another bias term to it, and passing on the output to the next layer. Or you could be, in some cases, you could be taking multiple inputs and taking the maximum value of those inputs and then passing it on to the next layer. So through a set of layers in which you arrange these neurons, essentially you are able to do these computations where you're able to, for instance, recognize that all that set of pixels corresponding to that image, they represent this object, which is cat. And there are other kinds of functions that a neural network can learn. So I've just given one example. From the pixels, you're able to recognize what object that is, what kind of an animal that is. You could give it the values corresponding to an audio signal, and the neural network is able to learn the corresponding text, which is, let's say, for this audio signal, how cold is it outside? So this is nothing but speech recognition. So the previous problem, this is often known as image classification. Given an image, can you classify what this image is about? And this is known as speech to text or automatic speech recognition. So again, that is possible today with today's deep neural networks. Or you could give it the input, let's say in English, hello, how are you? And train a neural network, which for that input comes up with this output. So this is the same sentence in French. So this is nothing but the machine translation problem. Or final example, again, given a set of pixels corresponding to an image, you could train a neural network to automatically come up with a caption which describes that image similar to how a human might describe that image, right? So in this case, this caption, a blue and yellow train traveling down the tracks, you are able to train a neural network to kind of automatically, given this image, give that output. So what these set of capabilities have done is they have really, again, revolutionized kind of various products and how we solve various problems, right, arising in the world. So one example of a product, for instance, where this really had a tremendous impact was something like Google Photos. So around the year 2011 and 12, when researchers started to show that yes, you could build these neural networks through which you would be able to automatically identify what objects are there in a given picture. So when Google Photos was built as a product, the team decided to assume that capability as a given. That given a photograph that somebody has taken, through AI techniques, you should be able to automatically tag that photograph with the kind of objects that are there in that photograph. So Google Photos was therefore built in a very different manner, uh, where there was no explicit tagging needed of these photographs, where you assumed that all these photographs that which were taken by people could be automatically tagged using AI. Uh, Now, as impressive as all of these advances are, there are also very significant problems that still remain with these deep learning systems. And I've listed some of them. So one, we still do not have a very good understanding of why do these deep learning algorithms work so well, and what are the situations where they wouldn't work so well. And in particular, uh, when you uh, train these networks, right? Typically, you need to train them with, again, certain data, which is known as training data. And when you deploy them in production, if the data in production is very different from the kind of data that these neural networks were trained on, let's say back to this example, if you train a neural network to recognize pictures of various, let's say, animals, and now you suddenly feed it, let's say, picture of a very different kind, let's say, picture of a digit. Um, the neural networks can often then give wrong answers. Not only will they give wrong answers, they can fail in a very spectacular manner. So, unlike a human, because if you kind of teach a child, right, or you teach, I mean, as humans, let's say we learn to recognize various things in pictures, and now you, if you were to show me a picture with an object that I've never seen before, typically I would say that, look, I don't know. So humans, when they are faced with situations where when they don't know something, usually they know that they don't know. Whereas these deep learning systems, even when you now feed them data, which is very different, they don't know that they don't know. So they will often give out wrong answers in a very confident manner. So one very active problem where many researchers are working on right now is this problem of calibration. Can you automatically identify when the neural network doesn't really know what the right answer is, right? So when how do you detect those situations where the data that you are feeding the network is very different from the kind of data that it was trained on, which is known as out of distribution detection problem. So that's an example of, again, an open problem with deep learning systems. And again, I mean, so we have work being done at our lab also on some of these more fundamental problems. So for instance, on this problem of calibration, we've done some work with Professor Sridhar Devarajan at IISc. And likewise, I mean, we are not the only ones. There's a lot of work going on in the research community right now. Other open problems are explainability, because often these deep learning systems, I mean, what happens is when you build these networks, essentially what you're doing is when you train these networks, what that means is you're coming up with various weights with which you're going to multiply the input and the value that you're going to add. So you're coming up with various parameters associated with every layer of the neural network. So that's the kind of, again, uh, uh, kind of so this is what is involved in training a neural network. But now, to explain why is that network recognizing uh, the images of cats as cats and the images of dogs as dogs, sometimes it's not very easy to explain, given just all those various values of various weights in that deep neural network. Why is it making decisions a certain way? So how do you explain these decisions to a human? And this becomes especially important when you're applying these deep learning methods, right? In, for instance, in diagnosis, in screening for diseases. And then there are issues of creating a bias, fairness issues. An example of that is, so for instance, today there are a lot of AI-based systems which would automatically analyze resumes and help various companies shortlist candidates to be selected for a given job. Now, when you're training these models, if all you're doing is you're trying to mimic how humans made those decisions, one of the things that happens is often we as humans carry biases. So, for instance, in the world of information technology, there are numerous studies that have shown that often there's a bias against women. In certain studies, when they basically passed on the resumes to people to shortlist for selecting for a given job, they did this experiment in these studies where they simply changed the name from a male name to a female name, and they found that again, just that a simple name change from a male to a female name resulted in the same candidates being selected fewer times, and also being offered lower salaries. So this is because of some of these biases that we are carrying as humans. And if you simply have the machine learning system be trained based on what, let's say, the humans had done, you have this possibility of the machine learning system now encoding those biases. And when these are black box systems, sometimes you don't even recognize, yes, that this system is biased. So these are, again, fairly challenging issues that still need to be dealt with, even while all these deep learning systems, right, are having a lot of impact on the real world. So now, in the rest of the talk, I'm going to take you through a few application areas in which we have applied these deep learning based methods. So I'll cover work in healthcare, our work on applying AI for social good, where we have worked with NGOs, various not-for-profits, and applied AI to tackle problems that these non-profits were dealing with, problems arising related to sustainability, water sustainability, and agriculture, and then providing access to information in the local language. So one of our goals is to democratize access to information for every Indian in their native language. So that for those of us who are, let's say, attending this talk, we are reasonably comfortable with English. So for us, we have fairly easy ways to access information on the web because of our understanding of English. If you consider, let's say, a laborer's son in Chhattisgarh who doesn't understand English, can you make sure that that child has the same access to information on the web as you and I? So how do we make that happen? So that's another challenge that we have taken on. So let me start very briefly with healthcare system, and this is a slide which is slightly outdated. I mean, it is from about 2.5 years ago, more than 2 years ago. So what this shows is the per capita expenditure on healthcare in different countries, and it shows. And while the data is outdated, the trends are still the same. So US is the largest spender, where the country spends over $10,000 are spent on an average person in an average year on healthcare of that individual. This is not when the person falls sick, this is the average spend. And the US recognizes that this very, very high cost is unsustainable. There are other countries like UK where the actual spend is much lower. And in fact, some of the outcomes are even better, like expectancy. But if you were to look at the trend from year to year, all of these countries, US, UK, they're all dealing with a rapidly rising cost of healthcare. So the National Health Service in UK is also very worried about the high cost. Now, there's only one country on this slide where the average spend on healthcare per person is well below $1,000 US, right? That's India. And somebody who's not familiar with India might think that India is doing a great job with healthcare. But we all know the reason this number here is so low is because much of our population doesn't have access to decent healthcare. So, and this gap also tells you that if we were to really provide decent healthcare to everybody in India, which we do need to provide, we cannot afford to take the same path that other countries like the US or even countries like, let's say, Brazil, Turkey have taken. That if you were to, let's say, for instance, multiply this cost over $1,000 by the population of India, you'll get a number which is very close to, I mean, almost like half of our GDP, um, and actually more than half of our GDP. So this is not sustainable. So, so we really need to, as we go about building the healthcare system for India, we need to build it in a very different manner than the rest of the world. So to me, that's really an opportunity for us. That's not only a huge need, but an opportunity for us to leapfrog. And what would that leapfrog system involve? Here I'm arguing that essentially to transform healthcare, you need to do two things. A, you need to, this is a business model change, you need to make it more consumer centric, where you're trying to deliver value to the patient as a customer. And you have to make healthcare much more proactive. And this is where AI can really help. Um, Now, what do I mean by proactive? Essentially, I'm saying try and take care of a person as early as possible, right? So there's a particular saying, prevention is better than cure. It's essentially a generalization of that saying, that if you can ideally prevent a disease through various wellness programs, it leads to better outcome for people, and it also leads to lower cost on healthcare spend for the person. So that's the ideal, where you really ideally should be focusing a lot on wellness programs and delaying the onset of diseases. But if disease were to strike a person, what this slide is illustrating is that to the extent that we can shift healthcare to an earlier to an earlier phase, the better it is. So healthcare system is often built in these different tiers. There's primary healthcare, secondary, tertiary healthcare, and then there are these ICUs in a given, in a typical tertiary or secondary care hospital. And ICU is a very, very expensive place to treat a person. So if you can prevent the person from having to go to the ICU and take care of them early on so that they never really needed to be admitted to the ICU, it's much better for the person and also leads to lower cost. And that same argument keeps applying to previous tiers. So based on that, what I would argue is that if we can do a lot of screening for various diseases, either at the primary healthcare center level, or even before you get to the primary healthcare, when we are living our normal lives at home and at work, if somehow the healthcare system can take care of keeping this person healthy and giving them early warning, it will lead to better outcomes for people. And in my, again, as I've listened to the healthcare experts, this is really a major way in which by making healthcare more proactive, we can actually make it much more effective as well as much less expensive. So let me illustrate now with the help of two examples how AI can help make healthcare more proactive. So the first example I will use is screening for a condition called diabetic retinopathy. So diabetic retinopathy is a growing cause of blindness, and it can potentially affect any person with a diabetes condition. And in the world, there are over 400 million people. who are affected by diabetes. And India, again, is often referred to as the diabetes capital of the world. We have, again, um, um, at this point, over 80 million people who are affected by diabetes. Now, regular screening for this condition, diabetic retinopathy, is the key to preventing blindness. But what happens in a country like India is that we have a severe shortage of eye doctors. So about 45% of the patients uh, who suffer from diabetic retinopathy, they end up suffering a vision loss before they are ever diagnosed with this condition. And the way this condition is diagnosed is that you take these images from a retinal fundus camera and of this region close to the retina, and the doctors look for basically signs of hemorrhages, and based on these hemorrhages they diagnose this condition, and they rate that case on a 5-point scale ranging from no diabetic retinopathy to proliferative diabetic retinopathy. So what we did, basically our researchers did, was to see, similar to earlier I was talking about how today these deep neural networks, given an image of a cat or a dog, they can automatically classify whether it's a cat or a dog. So a similar kind of a deep neural network, our team started to see, given this image of these retinal fundus image, can you similarly train a deep neural network to now automatically classify this image on this 5-point scale? Is this a case of no diabetic retinopathy, or is this mild, moderate, severe, or proliferative? And after a lot of work, our team from Google Research, it was able to achieve results which were comparable to a general ophthalmologist. So in fact, they published this paper in the year 2016, about 5 years ago, where they showed these results comparable to a general ophthalmologist. And you can look at some of these comments. The medical community kind of really found that paper to be extremely both interesting and in some sense representing. I mean, from this quote, for instance, they refer to this as the brave new world of medicine. So in fact, last year, this paper was rated among the 10 best papers of this reputed journal, the Journal of the American Medical Association, in the previous decade. So the lead author on this paper was one of our researchers, Varun Gulshan, who in fact did this work before the Google Research Lab in India existed. So he had moved to India for personal reasons, and he was collaborating with colleagues in the US, but started that work in India in partnership with Shankar Netralaya and Arvind Eye Hospital, who were our partners in this journey. So since then, the team has actually shown improved results, where the next year they showed results which were comparable with a retinal specialist. And later they also did work to try and, just from these retinal images, can you estimate even the risk for cardiovascular disease for this patient? And talking about cardiovascular disease, it is pretty much the #1 killer for people on the planet, including India. So in India, we lose, again, the maximum number of lives to cardiovascular disease in the form of, let's say, a heart attack or a stroke. And what happens is, the unfortunate part is that it is estimated that of every person in India who's dying, let's say, of a heart attack or a stroke, more than half of them are actually not even aware that they are at a high risk for cardiovascular disease. So that's the bad news. The silver lining in all of this grim news is that there is actually a potential to add at least 10 to 15 years of healthy life to many, many people who are dying each year of these adverse events like heart attacks and strokes. So this is the estimate of one of the cardiologists from JIPMER, Dr. Santosh, that we have been collaborating with. And what we are essentially trying to do is today, with the help of things like mobile phones and wearables, and the various sensors that they carry, you can actually infer a lot about the body vitals of the person, things like their heart rate, how much exercise they're getting, are they smoking or not, what are they eating, and so on, right? If you can convince the person who's the user of the mobile phone to take pictures and share pictures of the food that they're eating, by analyzing those pictures, you can actually estimate what's the level of calories, and you can actually often classify those pictures. Are there any fruits or vegetables in that food, and so on, right? So how nutritious is that food? And by classification, you can often even estimate things like how much is the salt content in that food that this person is eating. So the idea is to, by extracting out all these kind of signals from that data, some of which itself requires AI, you can then further apply, develop models that are able to predict the risk score of an individual for cardiovascular disease. So are they at a high risk of cardiovascular disease based on the blood pressure, heart rate readings, and so on, right? And how much exercise they are getting, and so on. And the idea is that with those models, you can then start to suggest interventions, both lifestyle modifications, for instance, convincing them to exercise for at least 30 minutes each day, or asking them to quit smoking, or asking them to restrict their diet such that they are not taking more than 5 grams of salt per day, and so on. You could suggest lifestyle modifications or early medical interventions, like if their blood pressure is high, getting them to, if necessary, take medication to keep it under check. And if you're able to, again, convince the people to uh, change their lifestyle and go for early medical interventions, again, there are many years that you can add to their lives, of healthy living to their lives. And so this is one of the formal studies that we are right now in the process of that we have designed, and we are looking at launching it in the coming months, where the idea is to be able to show, again, that for a person with hypertension, with high blood pressure, the aim of this clinical study is to show that through a combination of these interventions oriented towards diet, exercise, and so on, you can actually bring down their blood pressure with time, similar to what a medicine does. So, again, I mean, as you can see, this is potentially a fairly powerful paradigm, where by inferring what a person is doing and analyzing that data, you can provide them fairly kind of useful advice about what risk factors to avoid and how to change their lifestyle and go for early medical interventions that can lead to a healthier life for people. Now, an obvious problem that arises with such a solution is the data privacy concern, right? Because all this health data is extremely sensitive, right? So if I am, whatever, let's say, a user of these mobile phones and wearables, I may not want a third party to know what all I'm doing, what food I'm eating, whether I'm smoking or not, and so on. How much sleep I'm getting. So, so, uh, so, so the question is, can you do some of this analysis in a manner that still preserves the privacy of the individual? And this is where, again, there's been a particular technology developed at Google Research, which is now has become popular with many other organizations, called federated learning, uh, where you can uh, uh, develop these models in a manner that the raw data, which is captured on a mobile device, let's say this data, which is capturing how much exercise I'm getting, photographs of the food that I'm eating, and so on. I may not be comfortable sharing that data, so I never need to share that data with the centralized server. But you have, instead of the raw data being shared, you have, again, these machine learning models being run locally, and then you have certain parameters of those machine learning models being shared with the server, and then aggregated, and then kind of the global models deployed back on the mobile phones. And together with techniques like differential privacy, which essentially assure you that even the centralized model is unable to recover the individual data for any single person, you're able to guarantee the privacy of the individual while still being able to make use of all of that data to build these models. So again, shifting gears, I know I've spent a fair amount of time. I did want to go more in depth into at least one area, which is healthcare. Now, let me just cover a few more areas very quickly. So we have this AI for Social Good program led by Milind Tambe, one of my colleagues who also holds a professor appointment at Harvard, where we went to NGOs and asked them to describe the problems that they were dealing with and try to see if we could use AI to make a difference to tackle those problems. And to give you one example, we worked with this NGO called Arman, which is trying to improve maternal and child health. And what they do is right starting from pregnancy. So what they do is they work with expecting mothers, and they provide this service called Emitra, where there's a free mobile voice call that gets made with a recorded message. And every week of the pregnancy, there's a specific message being delivered, which is relevant for that week with some helpful tips. So for instance, oh, you need to be concerned about anemia. Therefore, during this week, you should be taking an iron tablet. And they've seen that women who stay with this program, they end up with better outcome both for themselves and their baby. This program actually continues for up to 12 months after the baby is born. But they found that often, roughly half of the women, for various reasons, end up dropping out of the program. So they asked us to see if it was possible to predict which of these women were at a high risk of dropping out. And could you, again, uh, uh, intervene early for those women? So again, together with IIT Madras, we developed these AI models, and they were able to, with a fairly high accuracy, they were able to predict it, identify over 80% of the women who were at a high risk of dropping out. They were able to identify, this model was able to identify, and this has been deployed in production at Arman, and now we are in the process of scaling it. To give you a few more examples, we have our Earth observation science team. What it is doing is it is trying to see from satellite images, can you apply computer vision techniques to tackle various problems that arise in various contexts like Earth Engine or areas like in problems of agriculture. So for instance, in agriculture, for a farmer, today it is an extremely cumbersome and an expensive process for a bank to figure out whether it should be giving a loan to a farmer or to be giving, let's say, a crop insurance to a farmer, let's say for their soybean crop. Now, if you were able to, based on satellite images that are covering, let's say, that farmer's field, if you were able to automatically identify, oh, this farmer has so much of area under cultivation for, let's say, a specific kind of crop, and that crop is soybean, uh, uh, you can actually, again, dramatically improve the efficiency uh, and the reliability of this data, and you could dramatically expand the availability of credit to the farmers and make things like crop insurance much more affordable than it is today. So what this team is doing is they are working on, again, these problems like crop classification, soil moisture mapping, and an initial problem that they worked on was with the Google Earth Engine team on given um, basically uh, any point on the map, can you automatically classify whether it's a forest or is this a grassland, is this an agricultural area or a human settlement, and so on. And again, I mean, so I won't go through the details, but again, they've been utilizing some of these techniques like self-supervised learning is one technique to help do this analysis more effectively. And just very briefly, in self-supervised learning, what you're doing is you first mask out the color of that image, and then you try to make the deep learning model automatically learn the color. So here, even without doing any labeling, the reason it is called self-supervised learning is that you already have all of that data available. And when you make the deep learning model learn the color, in the process, the deep learning model is forced to learn robust representations of things like water body, grass, forest, agricultural area, and so on, because typically the color of a water body would be different from the color of grass or from the typical color that you would see in a human settlement, and so on. So this is just, again, to give you a flavor of how this team is going about doing that work. And maybe the last problem that I'll talk about is democratizing access to information. That in India, we have about over 100 major languages, and we have 22 official languages, and only about like 1/10 of our population actually speaks English. So in fact, for the Google Assistant product, which allows you to do queries based using voice, Hindi happens to be the second most used language for Assistant, Google Assistant globally, after English. And you run into a lot of very interesting challenges. So for instance, with Google's search, here's example of some of the problems, right, that we run into. So somebody might kind of misspell certain words. Let's say when you see this query like double bed furniture, and now the word furniture has been misspelled in a very kind of in a manner that a native English speaker would find it hard to recognize that this means furniture. But if you look at it phonetically, this makes a lot of sense because phonetically, this spelling of furniture pretty much kind of maps to how you would actually pronounce the word furniture. So we have this project called Endophoneme, where we are able to extend both the speech recognition system and the query handling system to be able to handle all kinds of misspellings and mispronunciation, which are influenced by our native language, right? Because the way a person from Bengal, let's say, mispronounces a word would be very different from the way a person from, let's say, Haryana or Bihar might mispronounce a word. So what we do is we capture all of these different variations of, let's say, a Gujarati speaker or a Marathi speaker or a Punjabi speaker and so on, and we model the different variations of a given word, and we try to make this speech recognition and query processing system robust enough to be able to understand those variations. Uh, and let me skip some of this. So I'll just, some of you may be familiar with this technology called BERT that was developed at Google, which has really, again, led to a very significant advances in the field of natural language processing. Um, and the idea behind BERT was very simple. I mean, similar to the problem, right? That you kind of, when we were kids in school, right? Teachers used to give us these assignment, these questions, fill in the blanks. Let's say you have this text, and we were asked to fill in the blanks. Uh, BERT is trained in a very similar manner, that you take a lot of text that exists and you mask out certain words, and then you force this deep learning model to fill in the blanks, to automatically identify which words are missing. And in that process, you force the deep learning model to kind of understand what this text is all about. And BERT is bidirectional. So to fill in this word, I both look at text prior to this. So Obama was dash in 1961. So I'm able to both look at the prior context as well as what some of the text that comes after that. And by seeing both the text prior and later, doing this in a bidirectional manner, BERT was able to fill in these blanks far more effectively, and in the process start learning fairly kind of good representations of many of these words in a contextual manner. But again, one issue with BERT is that the original BERT only handled English. So Google research developed something called multilingual BERT, which handled about 100 different languages. But we found even that multilingual BERT was not doing very well on Indian languages. So at our research lab in India, we developed something called Mural, multilingual representations for Indian languages. And on various tasks like named entity recognition, sentiment analysis, and so on, we showed that we were able to improve the accuracy by about 10% for these tasks. And for transliterated text, where, for instance, you may have a Hindi query, which is written using English script, we were able to show something like close to 28% improvement. So again, I mean, this is ongoing work where our goal is to be able to, again, make these Google products like Google Search Assistant be able to support the different Indian languages, many more Indian languages, and support them in a more effective manner. So I've given you kind of hopefully a flavor of some of the real world problems that are being tackled using AI. But what I've shared is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we live in a very, again, interesting and challenging world. And again, with the growing availability of data in electronic form and with the kind of growing compute power at our disposal, there are a lot of very, again, interesting and meaningful problems that can be solved using AI. So I hope, certainly in particular the students in the audience, they are excited about the potential to take some of your learnings from the computer science and AI education to be able to apply these learnings, right, to make a real difference, right, to the world at large. So let me stop here, and again, sorry, I've probably run over, but again, if there is time, I can take a few questions.
Thank you so much, sir. I now request Dr. Sanjay Chetnis, sir, Chairman, Department of Computer Science and Technology, to please moderate the question and answer session.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I request all participants to please put in questions into the chat room. If you want to speak directly, you can also request to unmute yourself and then you can ask. So we have questions started flowing in. First question is from Dr. Anbunathan. Can you provide some use cases in which AI and big data analytics are working together?
Sorry,
yeah.
Some use cases where?
AI and big data analytics are working together?
Just give me a minute. There's a aircraft which is making it. Now the aircraft is gone. Yeah. Sorry. Can you
Okay.
repeat the question? I couldn't
Yeah,
hear.
so the question is from Dr. Anbunathan. Can you provide some use cases in which AI and big data analytics are working together? It's there in the chat.
Are
Working together.
working together. Uh, so AI and big data analytics.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, typically, I mean, a lot of these examples are which I mentioned, right? Things like healthcare. I gave examples in agriculture. Today you have also customer care, right? Where you have these chatbots through which you kind of look at the information that is coming from the user, and you have to infer kind of the intent of the user. You have to understand what problem they're talking about, and you have to be able to automatically identify the solution to that problem, right, and suggest. So these are all examples. So I mean, customer care is yet another example, right, where you are applying all of these AI techniques. And where big data comes in is to again be able to train these systems. There's a fair amount of data that you need to train these systems, to train these natural language processing models, and to build knowledge graphs that represent real world knowledge, based on which you come up with the solutions.
Yeah. So next question is from Professor Arjun. He's saying he would like to know if you think deep learning algorithms can generate meaningful text sentences, specifically GANs. If yes, how far we are already?
Right. So there has been work done on, like, there was this T5 system from Google. Then there was this GPT-3, famous GPT-3 system
Yeah.
from OpenAI, which does these text sequence to sequence transformation, right? So given, um, so for instance, it is able to predict, given the words that you're typing, you can predict what word are you going to type next, right? Or they've also shown kind of uh, almost like news headlines which are getting generated automatically. So on one hand, these systems show a lot of power. On the other hand, many of these examples also show the kind of dangers, right? That there's a lot of, for instance, fake news generation, uh, and kind of fake copies of even videos getting created and so on. So again, GANs are a way to, in particular, help us make. So in particular, what many researchers have shown is sometimes through some very simple modifications to the data, you're able to get, essentially, an adversary can basically get fairly garbage kind of answers out of the deep learning systems. So GANs are a way to now train these networks to become uh, more robust, right, to these perturbations of data. So today, I mean, I would say we have both. I mean, on the positive side, we have these systems which are able to do many of these text sequence predictions quite convincingly. So in fact, we use those tools all the time, right? So often now, when you're typing your email, Gmail can start to suggest words that perhaps you meant to write next, right? And often you see it is coming up with very good predictions of what you were planning to write next. So we are seeing that's the positive part. But again, the negative part is, through this process, you can also generate a lot of, again, fake kind of text, and researchers have also shown that there's a lot of bias that these systems can carry, because underneath, the AI system doesn't really understand the meaning of all of these systems. So it can be fooled relatively easily by some of these adversarial techniques, adversarial attacks today. So I think there is research being done both ways in terms of how do you identify various weaknesses in these systems, and then how you improve these systems to become more robust to these attacks.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I have a supplementary question for this same. You mentioned GPT-3. So normally, I think these are huge networks with large number of weights, like trillions. People are also working on giving the same functionality with the smaller networks. Like
Right.
some people have worked on that. So, what do you think will be the direction? Like, can we? Is it the only way that we go for larger and larger networks or complex
No, no.
algorithms?
So you're very right. As you pointed out, many of these systems, right, which have shown these impressive results like GPT-3 and so on, these have been built by training these neural models with trillions of parameters, right? I mean, sometimes billions. I mean, actually, right now it's more of like billions or hundreds of billions of parameters. And if you contrast it with how a human is able to, I mean, even a child, right, is able to distinguish objects, and during our lifetime, right, we are able to make such decisions. We are able to learn from relatively small amount of data, right? So I mean, we don't need to be fed again trillions of labeled images before we are able to kind of make those kinds of decisions. So very active area of research is how do you make these deep learning systems less data hungry. And B, another aspect which is today, which is not very satisfying, is for every new problem, you essentially have to start training a new machine learning system from scratch. Whereas a human, I mean, as people say, right, that would be analogous to a human. Every new problem that you give them, if you were saying, okay, wipe out all the knowledge that you ever had and kind of all the learnings, right, that you have had through your life, just start trying to come up with a solution, right, to that problem from all over, from scratch, right? Humans make use of all of the experience that we accumulate. How can you have deep learning systems, right, that are able to learn how to solve new problems in an incremental manner, right? So many of these are still open challenges where there's a lot of research being done.
Sure, sir. Thank you, sir. Yeah. Just want to make quick time check. How long we can go from our side? Absolutely no problem. Just wanted to.
So I can go for another 10 minutes. Yeah,
Sure,
so
sir. Yeah,
should be
sure,
okay.
sir. So next question is from Karthik Pai. Can deep learning technology surpass human thinking?
Yeah, so I mean, so again, I mean, there are people who uh, uh, talk about all this singularity and so on, right? So what we have seen is already on very specific kinds of problems, right? We are already seeing again computers with deep learning technologies, right, surpassing humans for those very specific capabilities, right? So that is also referred to as the world of narrow AI and so on. Um, Yet we are very far from a system, right, which is able to come up with the same kind of, let's say, solve problems, right, which is able to think like humans. Uh, so, so, uh, so I think obviously everything is feasible. So over a period of time, there are researchers who do believe that at some point in time we are going to have very powerful systems which would be able to again do better than humans on a broader and broader set of tasks. But the way we like to think of it is not so much of a competition between human and the whatever the deep learning system, but what is much more interesting is to think in terms of the ways in which humans plus deep learning systems can solve problems in a far more effective manner, right, than humans alone. Uh, so examples are in, again, think like medical diagnosis, right? So I gave you the example of diabetic retinopathy. Likewise, there has been work done at Google Research on analyzing, let's say, mammography images, right, and trying to identify, is this a case of malignancy or not? Now, and the way we kind of are using these systems are not as replacements for humans, for human doctors, but more as, in addition to a human doctor, can you have a deep learning system which also analyzes that image and provides a second opinion to the doctor? And so there has been studies that have been done which show that a human doctor plus a deep learning system together can make better decisions than just a human doctor alone. So that's uh, another manner in which I would encourage people to think of how to apply these deep learning systems, because you don't want to kind of uh, uh, so we are still, I mean, several decades away. I mean, I mentioned various real world problems that deep learning systems have in terms of failing to recognize that they don't know something. Um, so so especially in various kind of uh, sensitive areas like healthcare, where you really do not want to make mistakes, where you cannot afford to lose lives because of mistakes. For a long time, we expect these systems to be essentially aids to the humans who are making decisions. But there, these deep learning systems can be quite powerful aids to the humans.
Yeah. The next question is from Anjali Gupta. She's asking, suggest some problem areas in medical imaging or healthcare to work on related to AI.
Yeah, so in medical imaging, there's a fair amount of work being done. One has been on kind of screening for various diseases. So 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 in particular, I mean, a lot of problems that radiologists work on. Uh, we are seeing tremendous advances based on computer vision techniques. So within Google research, for instance, there's been work done on breast cancer screening, lung cancer screening, and so on, um, uh, of various images, like X-ray images, and so on. Another interesting area in medical imaging is when it comes to, so there are areas like histopathology, where you are analyzing biopsies, images of biopsy. So recently there was again some work done at Google Research, where for prostate cancer, when you diagnose prostate cancer, one of the first things that uh, the doctors recommend is to get the Gleason score, where you analyze those biopsies and the pathologist comes up with this Gleason score, which is like a score representing how irregular some of these tumors are, uh, and which is again an indication of how uh, like uh, how bad the case, how aggressive that case of prostate cancer is. So it's usually a score up to 10, where a score of, let's say, 5 or below represents relatively mild form of prostate cancer, and a higher score, something like 7 or 8, means a very aggressive form of prostate cancer. So again, recently there's been work done at Google Research where, using these AI techniques, they were able to obtain results which were comparable to the Gleason score determination by the expert pathologists. So again, overall, I would say in many of these medical imaging, you can apply AI, and likewise in healthcare. Uh, I think I gave some examples that you could essentially predict. You could also apply AI to predict future complications and suggest timely interventions. So things like cardiovascular disease and so on were the examples that I used.
Yeah. Next question is from Pratik Ashok. How is AIML going to affect the cybersecurity job market? Also, what are the current technologies that one should be familiar with when aspiring for a safe job in cybersecurity space?
Right. So again, in cybersecurity, you see a lot of AI being applied to, for instance, detect various cyber attacks. Right. So there are attacks like uh, distributed denial of service, or there could be these attacks where you're like advanced persistent threat and so on. So often AI techniques are applied to, for instance, identify outliers, situations, right? If, let's say, the amount of network traffic is uh, is too high, right? Is basically different from the normal network traffic. Sometimes that kind of an outlier behavior is used to identify an attack. But then what happens is, uh, correspondingly, the attacks are getting more and more sophisticated. So the attackers are also utilizing their understanding of AI and saying, oh, I know because there's an outlier algorithm, right, that might detect this attack if I were to have very, very high network traffic. Therefore, I'm going to attack in such a manner that the network traffic does not kind of cross that threshold that identifies it. I mean, that is able to let an outlier detection algorithm very easily identify that attack and so on, right? So the attacks are also getting more and more sophisticated. So correspondingly, you need, again, more advanced AI techniques, right, to be able to detect these kind of cyber attacks and to be able to protect these systems.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. I think there are many more questions, but our time is up. So I would request now our Dean sir to propose vote of thanks.
Yeah, very good evening, sir. Yeah, I think I really enjoyed your talk. There are so many problem definitions at the end of your talk, I think, which students and both faculty can take it up. It was completely a case study based, really illustrative talk. And the things like the, the federated learning, where most of the learning models are computed locally, they are all extremely useful and very current for the kind of problems that our students and faculty are looking for. And the problem definition, like how to make deep learning to be less data crunching and data intensive, that was also a very useful tip for us. And of course, when a talk comes from Google, we know what to expect from a Google expert. So very nice of you, sir. It was very revelating to hear to you, and our students and faculty have got the best use of your talk. So thank you very much. We look forward to many more. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. This was Murthy here. Thank you, Srinivas.
Oh, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
It was very good. Very good.
Yeah. Nice stuff.